welcome everyone who's here from both the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois at Chicago. We have an exciting and important session today with two presenters. Terry Clark, who most of you know, he's been part of this conversation at UIC for this Zoom session, but also is, of course, a professor for many of you at the University of Chicago. One of the foremost sociologists in the world, actually. So we're lucky to have Terry participating today. In addition, we have Ray Lodato, and both Terry and Ray are going to be talking about one of our former colleagues in the new Chicago School, Bill Grimshaw. We'll ask Terry to start with just a brief overview of who Bill Grimshaw was, and then go to Ray Lodato, who is working on the final book that Bill had started. So Terry, we'll let you begin.
Okay. The background. Yeah. Am I? Yeah. I'm not you. The background is I didn't work closely with Bill for a number of years. I knew about his work. I'd read a bit of several books, but then with the campaign leading to the election of Harold Washington, he was visibly active, and I called him up and I said, Bill, this is the most studied city in the world. Harold Washington may well win, but in any case, we're going to change everything. This is going to change a lot. And you really ought to do an oral history or some kind of recollection of what's happening. He said, no, Terry, I'm too busy. I'm campaign manager with Jackie, and he hung up. I called him again a month later, and I said, Bill, this is really essential. And he hesitated a second. He said, I'll do it on one condition. I said, what's that? That you do it with me. And I gulped, but I said, well, okay. And so we worked together for, I don't know, 20 years or so, something like that. And at the beginning, it was a wonderful, positive, easygoing, consensual, I won't say always consensual, but it worked well. As we went on and Daley too got elected, Bill got more and more acrimonious, not so much with me, but with Daley, with the city, with the whole situation. And he didn't want to really engage in things that were otherwise. So in the meetings, which Dick and which we had with 15, and when we first taught this course, it was a seminar where everybody was there, and all the faculty were there, and the faculty argued with each other. And Bill was one of the most outspoken, critiquing the Daley machine, the Daley hierarchy, etc., and saying, Harold's got to change all of this. And Harold did. The most visible example is I won't go on there. So Bill, just two more words. He grew up what he described in a sort of working class area of Chicago. He got a PhD at Urbana, didn't he, Ray? Yeah. And then he came back. He taught a little bit at the USC. He had state positions with the governor. He was then the key leader of all the social sciences at IIT for decades, and has great stories. Students who would see him on campus, he'd come up to. He hadn't seen them for 20 years, and he said, "You're still working on this campus? What's wrong with you? You shouldn't still be here," etc. There were two fantastic sessions just after he passed at the Chicago Theological Seminary, and one downtown at a restaurant, both led by Jackie. And I have 6 hours or so of videos of all this stuff by people who worked with him, from Dorothy Tillman to Jackie, of course, et cetera, Tony Preckwinkle and the like. Always controversial, always challenging, always pushing an argument. At the same time, the big theme was, how did Harold Washington ever win the campaign, and how did he beat the Daleys and the whole Irish machine, including Jane Byrne? And the simple answer is two Irish Catholics ran against each other, and they split the vote, and they split the vote three ways because Harold was also running. And because of that, he only had a third of the vote, but he had one more vote or two or three than the two others, and therefore he ran for mayor. And then, and after he won the primary in the Democratic Party. Okay, that's a quick overview. I would just stress, in one more sentence, since it's not on the reading list, he did a book on the schools, and the schools have become increasingly important, interwoven with mayoral politics, and I would say almost defeating Rahm Emanuel, because the union really took him on openly, and the union for the first time really joined with, and this is what the Zach Dan Silver et al. Analysis is very subtle and important to look at closely. Who's exactly voting for whom and where and why? The neighborhood groups teamed up with the school union, and that never happened before. And together, they really, I'd say, killed Rahm Emanuel. And that's continuing right now. I mean, it is hearing to for installation as the ambassador to Japan. People are still protesting against Rahm Emanuel based on these kinds of issues. So it's never ending. So let me shall I end there? And
then we'll come back. You've
Sure.
got another hour and a half to go at 5 o'clock. So Ray, we'll turn it to you to talk about the current book that you're working on that's part of Bill Grimshaw's legacy.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. And I'm fascinated by the fact that you're going to get through Chicago corruption in 1 week. I really appreciate you including me in this. Bill was both a friend and a mentor. As Terry mentioned, he's taught at the University of Chicago. I took his class in urban politics my first quarter in graduate school, and he was his campaign work was always in behalf of progressive and reform candidates who were looking for a fair and more just and more racially inclusive Chicago. And his work focused on the topics of racial politics in the city and the Democratic machine's efforts to kind of thwart those advancements. Bill also did research on labor unions in Chicago and the Chicago public schools, as Terry mentioned. And so at the end of his life, he had combined all of these research questions together into this culminating project that his family asked me to complete after his death. So today I'll be presenting the work that Bill did, the first 5 chapters of this book, as well as what I've been working on since, which hopefully is in the same vein of what he would have done. Bill started this project with the question, why is the socioeconomic and political standing of working class African Americans in Chicago so precarious, despite their numerical strength and the length of their residency in the city? Bill started off by looking at 2 competing theories of this phenomenon. First, William Julius Wilson's theory that the loss of working class jobs due to a decrease in manufacturing jobs, they were replaced by jobs in the suburbs or other places that were hard to reach, and the creation of the emphasis on pink collar jobs, which were largely occupied by women, were unavailable to men. That had an effect as well. On the other side, another theory was Massey and Denton's, who looked at the impact of hypersegregation in perpetuating poverty. The idea that it was impossible to make economic gains when you didn't see people who were achieving anything because there were opportunities and chances were so constricted, again, by hypersegregation. So Bill offered a third theory, which he called a political theory, and he attributed it to Harold Laswell. Basically, who gets what under what conditions? We're familiar with the question, I'm sure everybody is. He decided that we could try to understand this by looking at institutions that can and have served as vehicles for upward mobility in Chicago. So he chose the Democratic Party, labor unions, the Catholic Church, and the Chicago Public Schools. And he states, and I want to quote from him here, these 4 institutions provided significant numbers of the white working class with upward mobility, elevating a substantial portion into the middle class. So each of them had been ways for groups in Chicago to achieve prosperity and political power. He asked whether those institutions had served that function for African Americans, since the time of the Great Migration at the beginning of the 20th century. So Bill took this big time period, the Great Migration to almost the present, and divided it into 3 eras. The first he called the Pioneer Generation, which constituted the African-American community from the Great Migration to the beginning of the Second World War. The second was the Activist Generation, which went from the post-war period to the post-civil rights era. I kind of chose the date 1972 as the end of that era. And then the third era was the Alienated Generation, which went from the time of the recession in 1973 to the early 2000s. I'm still deciding when that end date is. So the path of each of the generation is defined by their relationship to these institutions and the institutional capital available to them, which has varied greatly over time. Each of the institutions had little capital during the pioneer generation, but the path from the American South during this period of apartheid was one that they traveled nonetheless. Bill says that the pioneer generation came north with high hopes. Much of what they experienced in the promised land of the North was altogether new and exhilarating to them. Unimpeded access to free schooling for both children and adults, an opportunity to actively participate and even play a key role in politics, and to work for wages well beyond what they've been able to earn in the Deep South. The legal and extra-legal obstacles to voting weren't as present in Chicago, and the new arrivals were courted by both parties in succession, the Republican Party first and then the Democratic Party. One of his central insights about this time is that African Americans in Chicago began voting Democratic for president well before they began voting Democratic for mayor. It was through the efforts of Mayor Edward Kelly, who served from 1933 to 1947, that Democrats finally began to win the Black vote in local elections on a consistent and overwhelming basis. The pioneer generation had little experience with any of these 4 institutions of upward mobility that they encountered in Chicago. They were loyal to the party of Lincoln, especially because the Democratic Party in the South was so identified with segregation and racism. They were distrustful of unions, which were largely headed by immigrant whites and were exclusionary. And they supported capital over labor by serving as strike breakers because of this suspicion of unions. Their experience with public schools in the South was limited to attending school when it rained, according to one migrant. And the Catholic Church's presence in the South was nearly non-existent. So by the end of the period, Bill finds that the pioneer generation had become a little bit disillusioned by their lack of welcome into these institutions in Chicago. Labor unions were fighting for better working conditions in Chicago, in the steel mills and the packing plants, but they largely didn't include African Americans in their efforts. The unions that did have some African American members segregated them from whites, excluded them from leadership positions in the unions, and didn't fight companies that relegated Blacks to lower paying, more dangerous job positions with little chance of advancement. Okay. So this was followed by the activist generation, which emerged after World War II during the influx of capital into these institutions as a result of the New Deal. There was some courting of African Americans by these institutions and some increased prosperity, but that upward mobility wasn't found within these institutions. Okay. Following the Second World War, a new and more politically engaged generation emerged. This is also the time when we have the ascendancy of Mayor Richard J. Daley. He, as the boss of the city's democratic machine, he centralized the patronage jobs of over 40,000 city workers and other agencies as well. But jobs, advancement, and opportunities for leadership weren't distributed equally among Blacks and whites, despite the fact that Blacks had become the electoral backbone of the democratic machine. In fact, had Blacks voted the same as whites in the 1963 mayoral election, Daley would have lost the mayoralty. Then I think one of the most curious things in Chicago history, and especially Chicago political history, happens. In political science and in campaigns in general, I'm sure you all know this, it's understood that parties reward their supporters and try to expand their electoral coalitions to ensure their continuing reelection. So if people get you to in office, they're the ones you owe your first loyalty to. Daley engaged in an unusual form of electoral behavior after the 1963 elections, in that he actively courted the white backlash vote, which had backed his Republican opponent in 1963, and deliberately antagonized the Black voters who had provided critical support to him in that election. Daley became a white backlash candidate himself, one who undermined Martin Luther King's efforts to end housing segregation in Chicago, who called on police to shoot to kill arsonists and rioters after King's assassination, and whose political minions conducted the raid on the Black Panther headquarters in 1969 that killed its leader, Fred Hampton. So this led to a split of Black voters from solid support of machine Democrats into becoming an independent faction, challenging the party on issues of equity and fairness. We're going to cover this in greater detail in the discussion of the alienated generation, but the Democratic machine didn't, during the activist generation, provide a means of upward political mobility for African Americans during this time. The main issue focused on by local activists before King arrived in 1966 during the activist generation was the segregation of the Chicago public schools. An organization called the Chicago Freedom Movement was formed to fight for civil rights and racial justice in Chicago, as the national civil rights groups have been doing in the American South. In 1962, a teacher named Al Raby led a one-day student boycott of CPS against the practices of the Board of Education, which enshrined segregation in the city schools. When neighborhoods would go from all white to all Black, the attendance boundaries would be redrawn so that Black and white students living in close proximity didn't have to attend school together. When nearby white schools were underutilized and Black schools were overcrowded, the solution of the Board of Education was to bring in temporary trailers to hold classes in the Black schools. These were nicknamed Willis wagons after the superintendent who instigated the policy. Despite pressure from the federal government, including the threat of lost funding, the board never came up with a comprehensive plan that would provide for integrated schools on a district-wide basis. The gains of the civil rights movement were extensive, but they weren't as comprehensive as they could have been. The stalling of Dr. King's economic agenda created a division in the African American community between the middle class, which was able to achieve some economic success and access to higher education, and the working class, whose prospects were dashed in the midst of ongoing economic restructuring in the larger economy. In the alienated generation, Blacks in Chicago engaged in two parts of Hirschman's model, voice and exit, respectively. We know, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Hirschman model, exit, voice, and loyalty. I've taken two parts of that, the voice and exit part, and actually it goes in that order, really, voice and exit, as opposed to the way that Hirschman titles his work. At the beginning of the period, they took part in actions intended to expand their political and economic standing, as well as improve educational outcomes. But the limits that the institutions put in their way thwarted their ability to achieve upward mobility. In the political realm, the repeated attempts to limit Black political influence in the Democratic machine, despite the fact, again, that Blacks represented the base of the Democratic Party locally, led to the development of African Americans as an independent bloc of voters who were critical to the success of anti-machine candidates of any race. Black voters flexed their political muscles first by defeating machine candidates for Cook County State's Attorney and US Senate in 1972. And they were active in the reform candidacies of mayoral candidates William Singer and Richard Newhouse in 1975. 2 years later, they gave Harold Washington 5 awards in the 1977 special election. And they were critical, with 59% of their votes, to Jane Byrne's upset victory in 1979. After Byrne turned her back on their support, similar to the way the first Mayor Daley had done, the influence of African-American voters in Chicago culminated in Washington's election as a liberal reform Democratic mayor in 1983, and as well as his election in 1987. After Washington, this is where Terry and I are going to disagree. I'm going to present Bill's argument that I actually also agree with. After Washington, the machine reconstituted itself under Richard M. Daley, the son of the former mayor, who served from 1989 to 2011. I think if we remove the trappings of what Daley did in office and look at its actual effects, we see that none of these institutions, two of which Daley himself was in charge of, provided opportunities for upward mobility for working class African Americans during this period, and that the blocking of those avenues led to the development of the alienated generation and the exercise of the exit option, which we'll get to. In terms of the Democratic Party, Daley kept a firm hold on power, didn't elevate African Americans to positions with any meaningful power in the party during his own tenure. Daley did appoint Blacks to positions in his administration and in the adjacent agencies like the Park District and the city colleges and the Board of Education. But his terms in office did little to empower African Americans to achieve leadership in the party. The election of Carol Moseley Braun and Barack Obama to the US Senate in 1992 and 2004, respectively, were examples not really of Black politicians rising to positions of influence in the Democratic Party in Chicago, but were part of the machine's longstanding practice of supporting the federal candidacies of potential challengers so that they couldn't compete for power locally, especially for the mayor's office. So supporting people for the Senate was a way to keep them from running for mayor, considered to be the more important office. No Black politician had anything approaching a measure of influence in the party, independent of the mayor's imprimatur. In the economic realm, conditions were, if anything, worse in the alienated generation. At the start of the period, the country suffered a major recession in the early 70s that contributed to the closing of steel mills in and around Chicago and eliminated whatever toehold the African-American working class had in the industrial economy. Despite ongoing legal battles and activism, some of this voice coming through, the mills remained closed, undercut by cheaper foreign steel and automation. The unions serving the mills were, of course, weakened and barely alive, and their openness to the participation of Black workers hadn't improved even prior to their demise. What growth there was in African-American union membership during the alienated generation came in public sector unions. With the movement of working class jobs to the suburbs, other states, and overseas, African-Americans looked for employment in the public sector, which paid less but was often more stable. Daley's development strategy also did little to improve economic outcomes for African-Americans. The city focused its attention on attracting jobs in finance and high tech, two segments where few African-Americans have found full-time employment. In housing policy, the city engaged in a process called fast-track demolition, where it used the broken windows theory of policing to claim that demolishing recoverable, affordable housing in low-income communities was essential to reducing crime. The strategy, which wasn't accompanied by efforts to create affordable housing, had the benefit of providing for-profit developers with large tracts of land to gentrify low-income neighborhoods. As we've heard this week, the city also pushed a very aggressive strategy of collecting water bills for amounts that were far beyond the ability of low-income residents to pay. There was little to no consideration given that the strategy primarily affected people of color and their ability to stay in their residences and in the city itself over the long term. One of the most intractable issues in Chicago during the alienated generation, again from the early 70s to the early 2000s, was the condition of the Chicago public schools. The period began with this ongoing effort, as I mentioned, to develop a plan to meaningfully desegregate Chicago schools. This was complicated not only by the fact that the issue was incredibly emotional, but also by the fact that white students were, by this point and continuing forward, a nearly negligible percentage of the CPS system. Whites had moved to the suburbs or gone to private schools in large numbers. So the turmoil also contributed to a virtual revolving door of CPS superintendents, undermining the effort to achieve long-term continuity and stability in improving educational outcomes. There were 17 superintendents in this period from 73 to 2016. In 1987, the US Secretary of Education called Chicago's schools the worst in the nation. A 2011 study by the University of Chicago of school reform efforts in the previous 20 years found flat or incremental increases in math and reading scores on standardized tests, a widening of the achievement gap among the principal racial and ethnic groups, and that most students who graduated were not prepared for college. To top it all off, the study found that the standards the district was using to measure progress and hold them accountable weren't reliable. A subsequent study in 2014 by the University of Minnesota found that the city's efforts to bring charter schools into the mix was also a failure. The charter schools were worse in producing results on math and reading measures than traditional CPS schools, and were much less likely to be racially and ethnically diverse. Meanwhile, the city invested heavily in college prep and selective enrollment high schools, which were populated nearly entirely by white residents. The strategy was intended to retain white middle and upper class families in the city. As for the Catholic Church, it reduced its footprint in the African-American community during this period. It kept parishes and schools open for an extended period of time after the enrollments had gone down, after the neighborhoods became almost entirely African-American, but declining enrollments led them to go through several rounds of school and parish closings, and exacerbated, of course, by the 2002 and ongoing sexual abuse scandal, which has cost the church, by recent estimates, $80 million in settlements in Chicago alone. Daley's reign as mayor didn't provide avenues for upward mobility for working class African Americans. There weren't initiatives to break down the hyper segregation of the city's housing stock or to integrate the city's public schools. So faced with obstacles in each of these sectors to achieving upward mobility, African Americans have exercised Hirschman's exit option, especially since the Great Recession of 2008. Hundreds of thousands of Black Chicagoans have left the city for good, the ultimate manifestation of this quality of alienation that Bill pointed out in urban politics. Once a robust 1.2 million people in Chicago, the African-American population is projected to be about 650,000 by the year 2030, which is less than 10 years away. This translates into a reduction in the number of city council wards, state legislative seats, and congressional districts. Even the election of Lori Lightfoot in 2019, the third African-American mayor of the city, didn't contribute to an improvement in the economic standing of Black people in Chicago, although any efforts she may have undertaken were hampered by the pandemic of 2020 to the present. So we have to consider that as well. So we see even in each of these periods, there are obstacles in the way of African Americans achieving upward mobility or stature or leadership in these institutions, institutions that are varied and have provided just exactly that, upward mobility and leadership for whites in this period as well. So that's the majority of what I wanted to present today, and I'm be happy to hear any questions.
Thank you, Ray. Any questions for clarification, and then we'll go to Terry. And I wanted to just add a little bit about Bitter Fruit, which the UIC class has read. Bitter Fruit tells the story of Harold Washington's election, and it compares the Washington administration to the first year or two of the Richard M. Daley administration, showing, so I think there are two main points. Grimshaw's book is a history of the Black political movement in Chicago. He makes particularly the point that Harold Washington's coalition had three components, all under the label reform. So reform for the Lakefront Liberals, the League of Women Voters, and the VGA, Better Government Association, meant good government reform. Reform to the African American and minority communities meant that, to use Jesse Jackson's sort of less felicitous phrase, it's our turn now. That is, that they had been locked out of City Hall and now they had a right to parity, at least at City Hall. And the third part was community empowerment, the empowerment of neighborhood organizations as a means of reform. So Bill was really seminal in unpacking what were the coalitions behind Harold Washington And we can talk about the difference and similarities with Lori Lightfoot's coalition. The other point that Bill makes forcefully is the makeup of the cabinet and the government under Harold Washington versus Richard M. Daley. And essentially tries to show that the number of African Americans in key positions in the city went down during Richard M. Daley period. But as the Harold Washington people would say, the floor was permanently raised. It's much higher than it was under, say, Richard J. Daley. And now we'll turn to Terry, and Terry will take about 25 minutes of your comments and then take a break and come back at that point.
Okay, thank you much. Am I permitted to have a screen share and show a couple of things in background while I talk?
I will make you a co-host in just 1 second.
Yeah, I have to be a co-host to do that. Okay.
Yeah, so give me 1 second. You are now a co-host, so you can share your screen.
Okay, let me see if I can get this to work. Okay, now this is 3, 1. Well, yeah, this is.
So if you click share screen at the bottom, and then you should be able to choose from your computer which screen you want to share.
Yeah, I just got a couple of windows open here. I'm trying to get the right one. Try this and see if this works. Yeah, the desktop one. I don't think I want that. I want. Oh yeah, no. Oh, here we go. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, and that's, see, I can't see it, but I think that's got, let me drag it up. This has got the chapter 1, Introduction, Trees and Violins, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. All right, this is what I want as background. That is, congratulations and thanks to Ray. I mean, you eloquently summarized what Bill has said more eloquently than Bill himself. he built in a lot more, no damn Daley, we're gonna let him have it, and so forth. And so we started the whole project to try to see, how did he ever get that one vote? And then after he took office, how did he manage and govern the city? I had just finished a book called City Money, and after, I think it's the first few months of Washington's administration, the front page of the Tribune had something on cities' bond rating downgraded, and then at the bottom of the page it had USC professor publishes book on city money. That was on the weekend. I got a phone call on Monday from City Hall and said Mayor Washington would like to talk to you, or how can he get a copy of your book? And so how should we get it to him? And so just a second. So he came on the line and said, can you come to my apartment tonight? I said, okay, fine. So I came to his kitchen in Hyde Park. He was getting his hair cut, and we talked for over an hour. I left him 2 books. This is the middle of council wars. He read 2 books within a month and told his chief of staff and finance people and press people to work with me, and I did with couple of people on leave from UIC, and then I trained for that. Well, then he created a marathon. Harold did, and chief of staff, whose name I'm blocking on for a minute, said, Terry, let's go in Harold's first Chicago marathon. And I said, I can't run more than 5 miles. So, well, neither can I, but let's train together. And I said, what time? He said, well, I have breakfast meetings 7 days a week, except for Sunday. How about 4:30 a.m. on Sunday morning? I'm a night person. I often had 0 sleep or 1 to 2 hours. We would then start running from 75th Street or so, where he was, up the lakefront, and we would stop every few hundred feet because lots of African-American leaders of the Washington administration were walking, stretching, working out, and conferring on the politics of what to do next. And that was the most fascinating part of talking with them and about the politics behind this. Okay, so this then led to the specifics of who do we, so Bill and I were then, well, so basically I became more engaged. I'd spend a couple of nights a week in City Hall, up to midnight, typing, working with the handful of people, the department heads and the people in the mayor's office were still there until midnight. I was there with them, and then we'd really talk. Okay. Jackie and Bill were highly diverse in their styles and in the people they engaged in the campaign and then later on afterward, ranging from Slim Coleman, who was a classic rabble-rouser orator, and others who were and Jackie, who went to college at Marquette and who knew the Irish Catholic style. So she worked in more of a daily traditional machine mode, whereas Bill brought in everybody, but they were all there together, and Harold won and then governed with a wildly set of different kinds of people. Before Harold and after Harold, African Americans never had a coalition together in the city council. I would stress that more than Ray or Bill may have done. Harold brought them together. As soon as Harold died, it collapsed. So Harold had a charisma, a brilliance of doing these things. And the speeches by Bill included, and this is something which I'll stress more, this is Dick Simpson's book title, theme, not title, but wasn't stressed, I would say, enough by Bill and by Ray. I'm not disagreeing so much here as saying that Bill is the issue. Harold's father worked as a machine precinct captain organizer. Harold himself ran twice for mayor and failed with less than 1% of the vote. He ran as a machine candidate. During the campaign, when he was finally brought in by Dorothy Tillman, Jesse Jackson, and the Grimshaws, Harold was not running as a reformer. In the North Side, a few months that when he was campaigning, he gave a speech and mentioned the word reform and said something about it, and the crowd applauded. And he said to Bill afterward, "Hey, what's this reform thing that they were so interested in?" And so Bill said, "Well, we can talk about that if you want." I said, "Oh yeah, let's put it into my next speech. Let's really do that stuff." He didn't invent reform. He was dragged in by citizens, is my point. Okay, so my basic point is not to disagree with anything Ray said. What you said was brilliantly done, etc. But to say inside Chicago, we have had in the late 20th century, two kinds of dynamics going on simultaneously. One is the continuation of the old with the institutions you very well described. And I really disagree with almost nothing that you said per se. What I would simply do is say we need to add what else was changing. And the big story I'll put in one picture here is on my page. Drag it down to page 56 here. This should be online for people who want to look for it. 56. And that this is the oral history that Bill and I then interviewed, and we got over 1,000 pages of interviews, fascinating stuff, and that's the core of the book. So this is my, without Bill's, interpretation of as we gradually moved apart over the years. So just look at this. The percentage of the workforce in manufacturing services from 1969 to 1996. Bill is mostly talking about manufacturing. I'm talking about both manufacturing and services. Okay, services are very narrow. That's a loose label for all kinds of stuff, from McDonald's jobs to high tech, to computer programming, to Google with its new building here, all sorts of things. Each of these are going on, but they have partially conflicting dynamics And if we are in this course focusing on mayors, we need to say where and how do the mayors incorporate each of these in which neighborhoods with which aldermen, because the aldermen are fighting and the aldermen change. And having worked with okay, all right. So that's the big simple point. Not that anything Ray said, building on this is wrong, but it's incomplete. And as this is about Chicago, not only African Americans and not only those theories which are overstated because they overgeneralize. And that here I'm not disagreeing so much with Bill as with my colleagues who he cited, especially Denton and Bill Wilson, who changed over time as well. Okay, so big point one. Where and how to have these then dynamics change in mayoral policies? Here I'll go up to page 4, and we see in summary form the early. I'm focusing on the earlier periods because okay, so from Daley 1, Bolandic, Jane Byrne, Harold Washington, Sawyer, Daley 2. Daley 1, and so just look at the headings and you see what I'm doing is bringing in here classic components of political science and urban politics and showing how Chicago changed. What I'll now add for you in conjunction. So what I'm saying is to understand Chicago, we shouldn't just talk about Chicago descriptively. We should bring in these big categories such as Ray illustrated with exit, voice, and loyalty. That's not just Chicago, that's a bigger theory. That's what I'm doing here as well. And then see where and how does Chicago differ from New York or Paris or Beijing? Because these we can use, and we've got data now for zip codes in these different kinds of places. And so what I've been doing and what I did before I worked with Bill was work on these kinds of issues across the US and internationally. So Bill really brought me into looking at this in more detail in Chicago. But what Dick has criticized me for is not publishing the Chicago enough separately and fast enough. Bill did more of that. And we've got it on websites, but it keeps changing as we see with Laurie Lightfoot. I mean, my God, what happened, etc. So I'll simply, let's see, show one more here, which scroll down here on the festivals, parks and festivals. I'll skip that and I'll get to parks as page 13. All right. The parks of Chicago are huge and major. They have become major drivers and become recognized as an economic development driver, not in the big fat institutions like the Democratic Party. But these are bottom-up driven institutions of citizens showing up. And look at the millions of people who go to Navy Pier. 7 million. This is in 1999. This is partially updated, but this is not here. Okay, 7 million. How many people visited the Grand Canyon in the same year? 5 million. The Navy Pier attracts more visitors than the Grand Canyon. The lakefront is a major, major driver of economic development, bringing people to come and live here and stay here. And they are not all African Americans. African Americans have been declining as a proportion of the city's population. And we have more people that the Chicago Tribune editorial folks started calling yuppies. Okay, yuppies. What are yuppies is still unclear. It's okay. But my point is, this is not just yuppies. These are also people who go to Navy Pier and who go to these festivals. They started as basically ethnic festivals. So we had gospel, we had rock, but we had 4 or 5 different types of distinctly African-American music. And African-American music, I've lived in Bronzeville the whole time I've lived in Chicago, never in Hyde Park. And the biggest thing I see is diversity among African-Americans. Bill doesn't play that up. But the diversity which were there in the campaign and then afterward and among the citizens and the voters of African Americans is dramatic, but it's not on front page of a lot of the press. Okay, attendance at the festivals here: Air and Water Show, Taste of Chicago, Blues Festival, Venetian Night, Jazz, Country Music, Latin Music, Gospel. Okay, so these were initially Celtic festival. These were ethnically driven. They became less so, and so Lollapalooza now is not ethnically linked. And we have themes which bring people from across the US to these festivals. And look at the numbers below. There are more people who come to these music festivals than come to the sports games. The old style of Chicago city that broad shoulders Chicago, this is getting smaller compared to the consumption kinds of activities. We have students who've done MAs on stuff like where do the divvy bikes get rented and where do they drive from and to? So we get people coming from African-American neighborhoods and going to very heavily a blues festival, but not to some of the house festivals, which more attract whites as well. And Laurie Lightfoot's election includes a lot of whites who were more bohemian, gay and lesbian tolerant folks, and who got mobilized on those grounds, not on Black power. Okay. Mass conventions. Okay, so how does this then work citywide? If you knock on the door of City Hall after 1993-94, the 93 Daley said when his staff who came to my class, I asked them, how much does the mayor support your activities on global impact and entertainment and tourism? They said, oh yes, he supports us. The next year I asked the same question and they said, we make 5 suggestions and he does 10 things. Daley embraced entertainment as an economic driver, along with being a political compromise. That's my original contribution in this introduction. So I showed that going mayor by mayor, but Daley too inherited, this is where I disagree with Bill and by simply omission with Ray. Daley inherited the city of the Beirut on the Lake image. His solution was not to go to each ethnic group and say, let's have a coalition among you. Instead, he brought in a totally new issue, which was lakefront festivals. That's why I'm playing these up, because this was a new driver of the economy and a political solution to the ethnic antagonism and killing off. And of course, the Irish, they had 6-7% of the population. If you just have the Irish voting for the Irish, the Daleys would be out in a day. The Irish did so well because they had for years figured out ways of doing things like this. And so Daley too, and this is where, again, Ray may have heard me say this, Daley too followed Harold Washington's policies more than his own father's when you look at the public statements. So he would say, no, Daley won, why'd you give those contracts to your son's insurance firm? It's a father's duty to help his sons. He embraced patronage and clientelism openly, what I called in the paper, the Irish ethic of spirit and the spirit of patronage. Okay, Harold Washington did the opposite. That is, after he learned from Bill what reform was, and he learned from governing, and he learned and he implemented a lot of it. But Daley too saw it succeed, and Daley too said, okay, I'm doing the same thing. I'm not gonna just, yes, I'll wear the same dark blue suits, I'll speak the same Chicago public school English, but I'm gonna do Harold's politics. And publicly he did, at the same time that under the table, he had the Hispanic Democratic Organization, and he was doing clientelism and allocating certain kinds of jobs in an old patronage way. So he did both of these, just as the Chicago economy was doing both of these. But it's a mistake to leave out, and that's why I have this table 1.3. This was the #1 convention center in the US in 1 year. It's later on, it's been superseded in part by Orlando and Las Vegas. So it goes up and down over time. But basically, Chicago is a major convention center, far more than New York. New York ranked 13th in this earlier year. Okay, so let me close my screen share, and I'll just hold up briefly and say what we've done to pursue this interpretation is look not only is in my arguments with my colleagues, my dear colleagues here. I say most of you guys don't have any evidence for what you're talking about, any serious evidence. Dick Simpson has his solid evidence in his history of the whole 19th and 20th centuries on contributions and voting in the city council. He doesn't have data on the preferences of the citizens and how they changed and what they wanted. And so in this class, which Dick is now led in bringing in, and I'm applauding because this class that you folks now are getting, you're getting readings on each of these things. So you see the scenescape stuff. This was not written just about Chicago, but Chicago inspired it. So my point is, I work simultaneously in these years, 15, 20 years, both on Chicago, where I would see these things happening in person. And then I would work, and this is where Dick said you shouldn't be doing this. I published a bunch of books on other things which were more general and important. So the rise of the third sector of civic groups. Chicago was the opposite of Robert Putnam's best-selling book, Bowling Alone. Putnam follows Tocqueville. And you see this in the bibliography. Steve is shaking his head. Steve's bibliography on American urban history is all about Tocqueville, civic association, and not in Chicago. And so if you go to Beijing and you go to Seoul, you go to Tokyo, and you say, how about Tocqueville, or how about Bohemia, or how about Richard Florida? This people say, what's that? What's Bohemia and who's Tocqueville? But if you do it in the right way, and so we spent 7 years meeting with the Asians, and this book is a result. Can Tocqueville karaoke? And the answer is, the same held in Chicago. If we come back to Chicago, the gangs are using music. The gangs are fighting each other over YouTube right now, more than they're shooting each other. Yes, there are people shooting each other, but they're shooting each other in part because of insults they've hit each other with in songs and rap songs on YouTube. We have another book on Chicago, Tokyo, and Seoul, with lots of maps of specific neighborhoods in Chicago, which try to get it at some of the kinds of things which I'm talking about by individual neighborhood, because there are huge differences across neighborhoods, and anything we say is true in some neighborhoods, but it's not true in others. So looking at the neighborhood level, the block level is the key, and that's what I'm encouraging all of you in this course now to do, to build on these disagreements that you can see from the past. But you're smart, you're young, it's been the new younger PhDs that have really changed this whole field. And I'm delighted that this course now, the third time we're giving it, is, I would say, is much more intellectually broad and informed of these debates. So we acknowledge and build on the Irish tradition and everything that Bill talked about with Ray updating. At the same time, we've got lots of new things going on, and depending on where you're engaged, which neighborhood, which issues. I mean, if you're working on global attraction of visitors to the Art Institute, and are there African Americans who work there? Yes, that is the point. Is not just in the festivals. Let me add one more quick thing, which is highly political. Where do my neighbors all go Friday night and Saturday night from Bronxville? They don't stay in Bronxville. They go to the north side. And who do they fight with? The police. And are they deliberately provoking the police? Yes, and bragging about it. Their motorcycles, many of the Saturday nights of these days on Lakeshore Drive over 100 miles an hour, the police don't stop them. And they're riding also on the bike path, hitting bikes, hitting pedestrians. and etc. So I'm simply saying these are hot issues right now, and they involve many different aspects of lifestyle and politics and jobs in ways that the old institutions, including the police and the unions, don't work the way they used to. One more quick reference, not to my work at all. Liz Cohen, Cohen, Harvard historian, fantastic book, which is not at all, where she directly counters Bill and Ray's interpretation, not only after the 60s, but also in the 1920s and 1930s. So she makes the point that for African Americans specifically, the Walgreens, the big national franchises, Walgreens and Sears, Marshall Field, were headquartered in Chicago, and Walgreens and Sears, especially Walgreens, deliberately said, we are not going to work with those traditional clientelist grocery stores and shops and other politically related institutions in the white ethnic neighborhoods. We're going to create Walgreens. So instead we will hire African Americans predominantly to buy and sell, to work in our shops, and to sell at a fixed price, not based on whether or not they know the person. And they destroyed those old ethnic shops in the 1920s and 1930s. She has data on all of this, and this is what I would talk about with Bill. And I would say, Bill, look at that even in the earlier years. And so I would say for Ray, at least bring that in and see how you might. That is, I'm saying you don't have to change anything you said, which orally here was perfect, but you could just add some more. Okay. And that would be consistent with a broader vision that Bill was maybe developing. Who knows? Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ray. Thanks, Dick and Betty for all of this.
So we'll take our usual 10-minute break that'll allow us to stop the recording and start over again, which makes it easier to get these onto YouTube. And we'll pick up in 10 minutes. So see you back here in 10 minutes, everyone.
Excellent.
Sounds good.
Ray, we'll let you make comments first, and then we'll go to questions from the class or comments from the class. Obviously, you don't have to agree with either of our speakers or any of the particular points made, but this raises a lot of questions about what is the history, particularly as seen from the African American point of view, or the African American history. So Ray, we'll go to you first.
Thanks, Dick. One of the things I forgot to mention, it's in Bill's book. I think it's even in Bitter Fruit, but it certainly is in this as well, is the change in the Daley administration, the second Daley administration from the first Daley administration. Well, Terry's right that there's not the same model of patronage. There's actually a different patronage model that is adopted in the second Daley administration. That's a kind of a pinstripe patronage model, where instead of providing thousands and thousands of patronage level jobs, entry level jobs to get people into the workforce, the idea is to court large corporations by privatizing city services, and in turn those corporations in turn give back to the mayor in terms of campaign contributions, for which there were for a long time no limits. So six-figure donations were not uncommon, even as early as when Daley first ran in 1989, or ran first time successfully in 1989. So this idea that Daley comes in and adopts the reform model, I really want to push back on that, because I think that that's really not the model he developed. That this idea that corporations had to be constantly courted, that they were job creators, and more importantly, campaign contributors, was much more the model that Daley followed. And it served, large campaign contributions served to kind of mute opposition to Daley when he ran, because he would start with such a large war chest, and no independent candidate could compete with that. And it led to a lesser, I hate to say it, but lesser and lesser candidates over time against Daley, people who started off having no chance to win, and proved that to be true when they ran. So I think that the model is different, but it's the same idea that certain people are favored and certain people are not. Again, this isn't a model. The pinstripe patronage model is not a model that really includes African Americans, except at the very elite level, and then only a few favored firms.
And Terry, one thing I think you might clarify before we go to questions is you had extensive writings about the new political culture that Daley had adopted, and maybe you can explain what was the new political culture and why was it important that Daley, or in what sense did Richard M. Daley adopt the new political culture?
Yeah, this was a critical example of how Chicago was in part a contradiction with the rest of the country, but in other ways, it was doing the same thing, but it just took longer and it came later. That's where I would say I had insights that my Chicago faculty colleagues generally did not, because Chicago just lagged in this. But I show it in 4 boxes. The dependent variable is the rise of the new political culture. The causes are within the economic, the social, and the government. The economic decline of agriculture and manufacturing, the rise of high tech, higher incomes, general affluence lead to more of an emphasis on market and market individualism in the economy. Second, social factors, the slimming of the family, decline of the extended family, more education, more media exposure, iPhones, all of this leads to more tolerance of individuals. So this was a small revolution, that is, of social issues rising, not only having new dynamics, but the decline of the simple. So what Ray, I'll tease him here, he's invoking the pinstripe patronage is the old Chicago model. How many voters changed their vote or really loved Chicago because of the pinstripe patronage? Few. What you should look at is not the people getting the big contracts for tearing down the buildings, which I'm also fighting with, but look at the young people who come here during the summer, go to these festivals, and say, this is fantastic stuff. I'm moving to Chicago. Chicago is also generating more art school graduates than any city in the country. LA and New York are surpassed by Chicago. These people stay on and they do they go into marketing, advertising, they do web design, and they've changed the city, especially around the north side, but also in Bronzeville and other locations where they're more often African Americans, and people, and some of those move back from the suburbs because they want to have the authenticity of the experience. They're not here for patronage jobs, is what I'm saying. That's the old, that yes, a few are, and there's some aldermen today who will still say, for sure, I like the way Chicago ran under Daley 1, and I'm still doing it every bit I can. But most don't say that, and fewer say that now than did in the past. So so the new political culture incorporates these kinds of changes, and I've sort of sketched them briefly. But in terms of Daley 1 versus Daley 2, examples I focused on, or that is for this course, don't just listen to me and to Ray. Read the book that Judd and read the book on Daley 2, and it builds on my interpretation written up here 10 years before that book. I mean, I presented this before the rest of my colleagues here were talking about it, but a couple of books that come out which occasionally have a footnote to Terry Clark, but not very much. But these ideas are there in the Judd and what's his name
Costa Spiro.
Yeah, Costa Spiro, the Judd and Costa Spiro book on Daley 2. I mean, it's got one, and it plays up the lakefront, the imagery of the lakefront and the like, which then was taken further, of course, by the subsequent mayors. Okay. Okay,
let's go to questions or comments from any of the 30 people who are on the Zoom event. Yes, Sean.
Hello, everybody. Mr. Ladata, definitely love what you said because my paper that I'm writing is around the lines of the decentralization of the labor market and how it affected African American community, affected minority communities. So you gave me a lot of ammunition there in terms of lit. But both of you gentlemen, something that, listening to your presentations, and you talk about the job market, you've talked about the Great Migration, you've talked about, kind of political candidates that were supported by African American communities that have not, kind of upheld their end. They courted for the vote, but didn't come behind with anything else in terms of jobs, resources, things of the nature. But what I noticed is absent from both of your conversation, and maybe it's a reason, and I'd just like to hear more about it, is the drug aspect. That you part of what was been talked about in terms of the decentralization, kind of went up into the 70s, early 80s, but then you had the crack epidemic that hit real hard in a lot of these urban communities and African American communities, and how that exasperated further certain aspects of poverty and already the disinvestment that was happening. Do you have any thoughts or comments around that? And I guess as we talk about these things, from the decentralization to, as I just threw in the ring, drugs, to politics and finding appropriate representation in local government, how do you see these things shaping our future going forward, now that we're past the Daleys and we have like a Lightfoot who's in office who's touted as a progressive, but what's next?
Okay, two questions. What about the drug epidemic? And one aspect of that, by the way, was the switch in the way police corruption works. And we'll be talking about that next week when we move from the mob paying off the commanders to the street gangs taking over the drugs and paying off the street cops. It changed the whole violence and police abuse case. But Ray and Terry, what about the drug aspects, and what about the future?
I'd be really interested in kind of gaming this out, because I'm not really sure how we'd measure that. And maybe it's not a criticism of it as a factor. It's a very important factor. It's a criticism of me for not really being able to figure it out. How would we get to knowing what impact that had, and knowing that we can attribute it to the drug epidemic, to the crack epidemic? So I wanted to see how those factors contributed to economic decline. If anyone has any ideas, I'm really open to it, but I'm trying to figure out how we would separate out the crack epidemic as a separate factor here.
Wouldn't you be able, though, to go at least from the increase in crime in the the African American community to the loss of the African American population? We lost 250,000 African Americans in the last little more than a decade.
Yeah, we're looking at that in the last decade. We're looking at the crack epidemic in '87 probably is the peak, right? So I'm trying to connect the yeah.
I guess my thoughts, in a small way are, if this sounds rough, I forgive me because I lack the words to say it in, I guess, a softer manner, but crackheads can't work. If they're struggling with drug dependencies and real harsh issues with substance abuse, I would figure there'd be some sort of decline in employment, that stretches what was already happening even more so. And I don't know, I understand what you're saying. How do you measure that? I don't know if you measure the type of crimes. I don't know if you measure people in drug treatment or people that died from drug overdoses. I don't know if those are ways to appropriately measure the impact of the crack epidemic on the African American community. But I don't know, those are just my 2 cents.
Well, I mean, maybe we could look at a particular community which might have had a somewhat robust middle class before the steel mills closed. When the steel mills closed, we see some economic decline, and then we see a greater economic decline with the crack epidemic following that in quick succession. So that might be one way to do it. I'm not sure what everybody else thinks.
These are critical issues and they're nationally important. This is Chicago, but it's not just Chicago. So there are people who are studying this it's done more work at Yale Law School in New York and Washington, Baltimore, Atlanta, LA. I'm not doing much original work, but I've been to several conferences. A number of my students and others are doing field work. And then also that is the Chicago specific has been ethnographies in specific neighborhoods like South Shore, Bridgeport, to contrast with Bronzeville and other areas. And I guess I would simply, well, one additional theme I would add along with the drugs is surveillance. And this links the experience of of people with records and people who have problems with the police. And not just the police, but the whole criminal court systems and the surveillance. So something, roughly half of the African-American younger men are being followed by the police. I mean, that they have to turn in records, they have to show up, they have to report what they're doing on a regular basis. And this sense of being supervised is a byproduct of the broken windows theory. That if you have, and so that there are 3 books I'll mention, really 2 by Forrest Stewart, if you haven't seen those. One is on LA, the second's on Chicago. And he worked with the gangs for 4 or 5 years. We biked together. So his quick story is the gangs shifted from their traditional violence, threatening, and collecting money to, guess what? The media. Making videos of themselves, posting them, and then getting fees and following based on the viewership on YouTube. If that's not the rise of culture and following a different from the Irish Catholic dynamic, it's not pinstripe patronage. It's a totally different dynamic involving and he mentions as well, young African Americans watch the social media roughly twice as often as whites of the same age. So there's a connection to this social media activism stuff in ways that demands attention. And second, the police have then given a lot of control. That is, the police are backing off with Lori Lightfoot. But before Lori Lightfoot, the police basically left the gangs a lot of autonomy in distributing the drugs. So the gangs show up and then, around Humboldt Park, they're there. The police have been loose. I don't know how much was payoffs or whatever else, but basically the gangs have been very important in distributing the drugs and control a lot of money and violence. But also then the question is, how do you have surveillance of any of this? And so in New York, they've been visible. You had with Bloomberg, and then and before him, what's his name? The guy with the Italian name, Rudy
Giuliani.
Giuliani. So Giuliani really implemented this. Then he hired the Boston police chief, who had been trained with Jim Wilson on the broken windows theory. Toughly implemented in New York. Stop and frisk, very tough. And then LA hired him away, and they did the same thing in LA. When Forrest Stewart was doing his field work, he spent 1 year talking to people in one neighborhood where there were homeless and African-American prostitutes, drug dealers, and so forth. And then in came the new police, and they were stopping everybody. And so he has interviews with the people who changed their views, who changed their patterns, with the implementation of the broken windows theory in LA. Then the police chief went back to New York, and parts of this you now have in different Chicago neighborhoods. And the Chicago police is in some neighborhoods, it's doing broken windows. In other neighborhoods, it's doing neighborhood autonomy. In other neighborhoods, it's doing white Catholic, keep out the blacks. In other neighborhoods, it's keep out the whites. I mean, that is, we got all kinds of stuff in Chicago right now, which makes, so I would say, rather than saying one of these is right or wrong or is Chicago, I'm in this session, we're mainly stressing simply two dynamics that Ray and I are and but in terms of the dynamic and change in the future, the same book I mentioned before that at Dick's suggestion, The New Political Culture, looks at the 68 events. And there were Black riots were very important in 68, from 65, 68, 69, 70. And what happened afterward to mayors? The big change was from 70 to 74. The answer was the taxpayers' revolt. So it wasn't a direct anti-Black, but it was cut the budgets of those cities which have spent, and that is what has happened in the last week in New York. They've elected a Black cop mayor, and he's directly opposed to the policies of his predecessor. And this is at one kind of answer, which we may well get. Toni Preckwinkle is working on running for mayor of Chicago right now. So she is a clear alternative. And everybody thought she would be the next mayor, but Lori Lightfoot came out of, all right. And so I'm not trying to predict, but I'm saying if we look at some of the dynamics, these dynamics are going on both in different Chicago neighborhoods, which we can compare across neighborhoods, but second, across cities. And so because mayors and the big election is the mayor, and different cities are going to be doing this very differently as we detailed city by city, plus the 3 volumes by the group of the 3 political scientists that were all around Berkeley, who studied first 10 cities around in the Bay Area. Then they did it nationally on African Americans in particular and some Mexicans, and basically showed how these transformed mayoral and general urban policies. And so I would say, yes, pay attention to drugs, but don't see it as deterministic.
Let's take a couple of other comments and questions. Daniel, you were next, then Tony.
Yeah, I have a comment on the use of segregation data as a measure. I think it's important for us to think very carefully about what we're measuring when we measure segregation. Dorothy Pittman talks about this. Huey also talked about it. That desegregation was a strategy adopted by the civil rights movement with the goal of getting the state to invest as much in Black children as it invested in white children, and that a lot of white people mistook it for the end, not the means. So for both of our speakers, I guess because you've both talked about measures of segregation as supporting your argument. What do you think you're measuring when you talk about segregation? Is that a measure of Black power, or is it a measure of the state investment in Black children, or a measure of something else?
Ray, why don't we start with you?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a measure of the state's investment in Black children. I take from Anderson and Pickering's work, Confronting the Color Line, that there are 3 main emphases of the civil rights movement: desegregation, integration, and Black power. They each went in a different direction. Desegregation was the idea of just removing the legal barriers that were in place to enforce segregation. Integration was much more intentional in terms of actually creating integrated communities that, by the measures that are most commonly used still to this day of racial concentration in geographic areas. And then Black power, which is to say integration is not necessarily the goal, but increasing resources to Black communities, even segregated Black communities, is the goal, and that should be what is emphasized. So I don't necessarily see it as a strategy to necessarily bring resources. I see it as something that was created by outside forces and then is adapted to by residents of the communities.
Terry, your comment?
But yeah, I would answer first as a resident of Bronzeville. This is one of the biggest divisions within Bronzeville. How much you favor openly, explicitly, or not integration versus segregation. And so I was in one meeting with about 20 civic leaders from Bronzeville, including Mrs. Barack Obama. People got along well with her. In the middle of the meeting, Mr. Barack Obama came into the meeting, and 4 or 5 people said, "Oh, sellout! What's he doing here? What are you doing in this place?" And then when he left 10 minutes later, and people then all leaned toward her, saying, "We support your," and the image was the front page of the New Yorker magazine. Has a picture of her with bullets across her chest and him wearing a Nehru outfit. Within that family and within the, okay, I won't go on, but I'm saying there's a lot of evidence there for looking at this. These are multiple complicated meanings. I have 3 new chapters in the book on trees and real violence. And one has a new section on Tony Preckwinkle and on this, which is there. The segregation. I mean, this is what my colleague, my demographic colleague who wrote a book, called American Apartheid. He's crazy. I mean, that he's imposing his demographic imagery incorrectly in a political and so we argued a lot at sessions. And when he brought in data, actual data on how much do people work with or dislike people of different ethnic background, he got very different results. So I'm not saying that there's not racism, but that they're different views of that a measure of living together or living apart is not a measure of racism and so Richard in Florida again has had a famous paper, Florida and Gates. The more gays you have, the more high-tech jobs. Are the percentage of gays in a neighborhood a measure of tolerance, a measure of LGBTQ, a measure of segregation, or what? And so I then countered and said, let's get some actual data on what people do. And it contradicts in the sense that you can have a large number of gays, but you then can also have people who are fighting with the gays. So having segregation or not is so. Now, my quick bottom line is Dick Simpson's book on the history of the council is a better guide to segregation than the demographic data. That is that there were battles going on where you had murders in the 1910s. This was Al Capone City, Merritt Thompson, so I would say, and there are a lot of sociologists today, demographers or demographically inspired, who just look at racial segregation or including, say, different kinds of Asian, ethnic, and they don't look in how to interpret the meaning of this or to connect this to views of ethnic collaboration and working together. I'll cite one. The other book I didn't get to is by Joseph Yee on God and Karate on the South Side is the title of the book. Brilliant book, God and Karate on the South Side. And what he pursues are young African-American men, say 15 to 30. Basically, what are the alternatives? They choose themselves. They're alienated from their mothers. They quit school. They don't know who their fathers are. But he found 4 things that they do join: martial arts, evangelical religion, Soko Gakkai, and a direct sales organization that was a Japanese inspired. So all these organizations basically say you've got to change your life, you got to have self-discipline, you got to work hard, and you've got to have the focus of doing your homework. And your martial artist master tells you, did you do your homework? How much time did you spend doing your homework last night? Oh, I was too busy. 20 push-ups right now. Okay, that kind of discipline is operating in ways. Or the other, just one more quick thing, Theaster Gates. Look at what Theaster Gates is doing. Look at what Joseph E. writes about. These are embedded with the meaning of race and building institutions that will help especially young, poor African-American men and women who are dealing with them in various ways, that provide many avenues for change and improvement. And in one conference, there was an NPR broadcast on this about a month ago by criminology experts, and they were, one of them listed 25 things in Chicago that are working. They're small, they're underfunded, but there are many things which are dealing with crime. And one other quick conference, from about 1400 to present, crime has been going down. We have less crime and crime. We have much less crime now than we did in the 60s in Chicago. I bike
Terry,
the other night.
could you put in the chat the link to the oral history, because it's still underutilized, and I think the people in the class would like that, or if Jake can
Okay.
put it in.
Sure.
Tony, your question or comment?
Yes, Mr. Clark spoke earlier, and he was talking about like the drugs, and when he got to talking back on the drugs and the killers, and he mentioned social media quite a few times, and how much you find African-American males on social media. I was wondering, are there any studies currently going on to identify the impact and role that social media has on the crimes and different things that are going on? Because if you look at a lot of people that these young people are following, Instagram and TikTok, they have blue checks, and they're what they call certified, but they're getting paid by the social media platforms to continue to portray and show vigilante style or ignorance amongst the community. So is there any type of studies that's going along with the social media side to add with everything else?
Shall I respond?
Sure.
Yeah, social media is not part of our study.
Yeah, just quickly. I'd say the main thing in an ethnographic Chicago mode is the same guy I mentioned, Forrest Stewart. He's now associate professor, whatever, at Stanford Sociology Department. And the book is entitled Battle of the Bullet. And it shows how the social media and building a social media reputation for yourself. Some of these guys are in gangs, many are not in gangs. So it's not just the gangs, they're individuals who are posting their videos and how they're building up their social media following. So he's got a lot of detail on who does the editing of these, who makes them work, how do they get promoted, and so forth. There's a woman at Princeton in sociology who's worked more on surveillance and those issues, but the social media more specifically, there's lots of work in progress right now. A lot of it's unpublished, a lot of it's very new. It's very, very important, but it hasn't been seriously pulled together well. There's a book by a woman who's the chairman of the journalism, has a different communications department at UIC. Dick, I think you remember her name. She has a great
Zizi
name.
Papadromas.
Yeah, say it again slowly.
Zizi, Z-I-Z-I, Papadromas.
Okay, Zizi Papadromas. Okay, maybe you need to put that up as well. But she has a great book on social media and how the Green Revolution in Egypt took off through the use of social media in getting people to come and protest together. So that and then she has a lot of ethnographic material. She has a lot of the press coverage, and she gave a talk. Building on that with people who are doing, and there's a big MA program here at the USC, and there are a lot of people studying these kinds of issues with fancy quantitative data, and they're joining it with these other kinds of data. So I would say there's look for what you specifically are interested in, but I mean the number which Forrest cited, that African Americans do this more, I think it is probably in many different places if you look at national surveys.
So before we go back to Sean, is there anybody else who would like to make a comment or a question? Sean, go ahead.
Okay, just real quick, just a couple of things. I actually met Professor Forrest at University of Chicago a couple of years back. This may have been 17 or 18, and I'm not sure if he was working on that book that you are speaking of, Mr. Clark, the book about the social media and the street gangs here in Chicago. But I did have to read his other book about Skid Row in LA, and that was very interesting because a lot of the movement, as far as the police moving the homeless people, dealt around gentrification in its proximity to, downtown LA, but that's another issue. What I wanted to touch back on, as far as the social media thing, I guess I want to add, I don't know if I could add a layer to what you're talking about, Mr. Clark. It's the aspect of, number one, it's not so much like regular people jumping on these social media platforms and then, getting the blue check, as Tony was talking about, where they're kind of recognized as a public figure and then the crime happens. It's more or less, these guys are like, they want to be rappers first and foremost. So, with that comes, I need a certain level of support. I need a certain level of backers, almost like a politician. So their backers are who? Easy answer. They're gang members, the people that live on their block, the people that they're in the gang with. Those begin their supporters. Now, you can start adding this up. You have rappers who need attention, you have gang members as supporters, and then you have social media. So you put all this stuff together, gang members are going to do illegal criminal activities, and they're filming it or calling out other gang members or other opposition. And that leads to more drama, more violence, more problems. So I guess I'm just saying this to add somewhat of a narrative to what Professor Stewart was trying to do and what he was trying to achieve with that study. So it's not just like random people. These are people that have things going on, but they're using it in a negative way, if that makes sense to you. They're unlike a politician that's looking for, well, I guess, we got a lot of bad politicians here, but outside of those that are looking for like negative support, looking for positive support, these rappers that are / gangbangers are looking for negative support that pushes them and makes them just as controversial. So I just wanted to say that last thing, and I'll stop. I guess this is more my question. To the drug thing again, I know we kind of jumped past that, but the only reason why I bring it up is because drugs as a whole can be an economic driver. So it depends on which side of the coin you're on. If you're the person selling it, think about it. We talked about deindustrialization. We talk about a lot of jobs being lost, a lot of poor and like messed up people financially. What becomes an easy alternative? Sell drugs. It's black market. You're going against the man. You're making your own way. You're doing your own thing. So it becomes a industry on its own. But then on the other side, obviously, you can't have a business unless you have customers. So when we talk about the high numbers of people using drugs that are spending money or committing crime, doing whatever to get the drugs, that becomes another economic factor. So you have spenders and you have buyers. So you may or may not be able to answer this question, but I guess my thing is I would like to see what is the causal relationship between the job market fading away and then the drug market blowing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
So, Ray, you wanted to go?
No, I'm saying that's an excellent point. I hope there's some data on that, but I don't know where I'd find it. But it's certainly something I'd be interested in looking into.
Ray, maybe just continuing a bit. You told us, sort of the story of the book that you're working on up through maybe the 80s or the 90s. How are you going to end the book? That is, where you were talking about the 4 institutions and how they changed, or how they were blocks, and how do you see coming to a conclusion of the book if you've gotten to the place in the arc where you're trying to bring it to conclusion?
I think we're gonna find that none of the institutions provided a clear and ongoing path for upward mobility for African Americans in any of the eras. So I think the conclusion comes to that last point I made about exit. That, you know, African Americans tried a number of different ways to become included in Chicago and to advance in Chicago. It was better than the rural South in the early part of the 20th century, but it's kind of run its course for a lot of African Americans who have decided that Chicago doesn't hold promise anymore for advancement or upward mobility. So I think that's where I'm headed. I think that'll be faithful to Bill's original work.
Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, two quick comments. One is don't give social media and rap over totally to the anti-establishment anti-middle class. That is, Kanye West, the #1 hip hop singer, recorded Christian rap. And I just looked on the web now, and it lists the 10 best Christian rappers, hip hop artists from 2017 onward. Christian rap is an effort to redefine what is on social media and what is rap in ways that can include and link with gospel and the Christian tradition and more so-called middle-class lifestyle. So, and that this is bottom up, I would say, more than top down. Second, to link this to politics more directly, Robert Vargas, was an assistant, or now is tenured at the USC here. He did a book on his Northwestern PhD, was on the little village neighborhood. And he contrasts the halves. There are two halves of it. One has very high crime rate and murders, difficulties in the streets all the time. The other half has coherence. The gangs work with the alderman. They re-elect the alderman. He pays them off with patronage jobs. It works in the old Chicago style. I'm simplifying a little bit, but basically they have a lot of money for social worker and for testing out these kinds of programs that help the guys themselves, as well as reducing crime. The second half of the same neighborhood is gerrymandered among 3 or 4 different aldermen, and nobody cares about the folks in the Pilsen neighborhood, Pilsen/Little Village, and in that way they have two very different politicized, and that is the type of surveillance changes, the type of linkage to the political system changes, the specific incentives and the types of gangs and the activities that gangs pursue are different. Instead of electing the alderman, as they do in half the ward, in the other half of the ward, they're fighting the alderman, they're fighting the city, they're fighting the mayor, and they're alienated. So each of these, and he details in a couple of 100 pages, these two styles in one neighborhood. So don't overgeneralize and look at the neighborhood and political specifics is my bottom line here, whether it's for rap, for Black integration, or measures of segregation that look at the meaning as well as the crude data.
I think we may be at the end of the conversation. We have more time if there are any last questions or any last comments that anybody wants to make. Well, we thank our two presenters. Those of you from UIC, if you want to stay and talk about your paper and your current work, that's fine. I'm going to stop the recording, hopefully, and we will reconvene next week. Thank you to both Terry and Ray for being with us tonight and for this challenging and interesting conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the info.
Okay.
Yeah, Dick, I'm willing to stay on a little bit with your permission, and if there are any students who have any themes and papers or whatever that I could help with, I'd be glad to, as I did once or twice before. But I'll drop out anytime if you want.
No, I'm just waiting to see their beginning to pull their papers together, and I just want to see if they have questions. But yeah, you can be an excellent resource.
Professor, I'd like to know, when is the final paper actually due?
It's due